Hello, my name is Eric Holmberg. The following presentation begins as a response to ABC TV's controversial program, The Search for Jesus, hosted by Peter Jennings. Part 1 of this video focuses on the 7 myths of the liberal critics made popular by the so-called Jesus Seminar. We will debunk these myths one by one. Although Jennings' documentary is now several years old, the misinformation generated by the Jesus Seminar is repeated endlessly by similar programs and news stories. In a future presentation, we'll look at how the heresies promoted by these liberal critics have provided the underpinnings for more recent novels and films, such as The Da Vinci Code. And we'll examine how Hollywood reinforces popular fallacies about Jesus through the conscious repackaging of ancient heresies. On June 26 of 2000, ABC Television aired The Search for Jesus, a 2-hour-long special hosted by Peter Jennings. The program took viewers to Israel and interviewed locals, Christian pastors, clergymen, and laymen. But Jennings focused mainly on 7 experts in the field of researching the historical Jesus. 4 of the 7 experts interviewed by Jennings were members of the Jesus Seminar, a group of liberal scholars whose academic studies have sought to cast doubt on the divinity of Jesus. The other 3 experts were also skeptics concerning the supernatural aspects of Jesus' life and ministry. Absent from the program were any of the great number of well-known and credible historians who have a deep, committed faith in the inerrancy of Scripture and the deity of Jesus Christ. The Search for Jesus relied almost solely on a school of thought called liberal theology, or the historical critical method. At the end of the 19th century, a school of liberal theologians arose in Germany. They were called the Higher Critics. Their proclaimed goal was to isolate the historical Jesus from the God-man who had been worshipped and adored by the church for 2 millennia. The divinity of Jesus Christ was presumed to be a myth. His many miraculous works were deemed to be legend. The effect of these apostates has grown to the current day as they have stripped layer upon layer from the Jesus of the Bible until all they have now is a mere common man.
The German higher criticism was an attack upon the original authenticity of the documents of the Gospels and of the New Testament, that they were written later and that they were written by people who didn't have firsthand knowledge of the facts and so on, and basically they were writing an idealized picture of a Jesus who never existed. And the German higher criticism became actually the basis of worldwide liberalism. Then in the United States at Union Theological Seminary and the liberal seminaries like that, they always appealed mainly to the works of the German higher critics. Dr. John Henry Ludlam Jr. was one of the greatest biblical scholars ever to come out of Yale University. He got his PhD there from the Department of Religion or Philosophy, Ancient Near Eastern Languages and Literature, 1951, and he has the distinction of being the only person there that they had on record up to that time, 1951, who received honors in all 6 of the fields in which he took his oral exams for the PhD. And all on his own, even though he began as a liberal and was nevertheless intellectually honest, as he read more and more of the 19th century criticism of the Bible, he began to see that these people had no case, that they were making it up, that Wellhausen was just a precocious 18-year-old who, out of his own imagination, wrote a, quote, history of the religion of Israel, but had no documents, he had no evidence, he had no archaeological artifacts, he had nothing, but he just imagined how the history of Israel must have developed, and he saw right through the works that they were doing, that they were making this up, that they had no case, that they had no evidence, that they had no documents, but that they came to the Bible with a worldview already made up, and then they were going to force onto the Bible their worldview and use their worldview as the test of whether or not a given passage was or was not authentic. So Ludlam actually, over a period of years, came to see that the liberals had no case, and he became a conservative, and he became an evangelical and a believer in the authenticity of the documents of the New Testament, the divinity of Jesus, and went on to Yale to get his doctorate, and became a formidable opponent of the liberals because of his scholarly credentials. There are many evangelical scholars of the highest possible credentials who still believe in the authenticity of the New Testament documents, who still believe in the divinity of Christ, who still believe in the evangelical position. They are not unlearned hillbillies. And one of the best examples of that would be Dr. John Ludlam.
Bauer, a German theologian at the end of the 19th century, was very anti-Semitic, and he was trying to divorce the scripture from its Semitic roots and just attribute it to this whole movement of Aramaic and everything else. But it started to bring German higher criticism. When I went to seminary, I went to a mainline Episcopal seminary. All that we were teaching was the German theologians who were basically anti-Semitic, and that's why they were criticizing all of the scripture to remove any of the Semitic roots, because it was abhorrent to their sort of Germanic attitudes about who should be extolled in terms of intellect. And there was a reaction to German higher criticism. It started off at Princeton Seminary, a great seminary, and that reaction was fundamentalism. And as you look at fundamentalism, and sitting within a mainline seminary, fundamentalism puts a grid before the gospel. It puts 5 fundamental points which we should believe in: the virgin birth and the resurrection of Jesus. All of those are good points. But by focusing on these points, this principled approach, you're distancing yourself from the gospel. This gospel is no longer speaking to you. You're now interpreting it through this grid, and this grid now has liberalized your theology. Your theology becomes less than a full-orb theology that starts at Genesis and ends at Revelation. So those two things just ripped the heart out of the theological community. And then the people who decided, who were on fire for the Lord and who were trying to retain the gospel and hadn't fallen into German higher criticism or hadn't fallen into neo-fundamentalism, those people drifted away from any theological education at all and started churches and institutions. And this is the weaker of the three, and I don't want to get people upset by it, but because they abandoned really the tough teaching of theology, the theology became watered down. And as C.S. Lewis said, watered down Christianity is worthless. So when you water down Christianity, either through one of those 3 methods, you open up the world to say this is bogus. And once they say it's bogus, they'll believe almost anything, which is including these snippets of Gnostic Gospels that were written at the same time. In the early church, you had the same confusion. You had theology by analogy, theology by allegory, and it wasn't until later when Augustine started to do systematic theology, when you started thinking through the consequences of the whole nature of theology.
The claims of the higher critics are nothing new. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, early Christians had to deal with ridicule and abuse from Jewish rabbis and intellectual skepticism from Greek scholars and philosophers. Throughout the early centuries, bold apologists for the Christian faith, such as Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Justin Martyr, wrote volumes of practical wisdom defending the Gospels from the attacks of pagan critics. Succeeding centuries gave the church many other brilliant experts in apologetics. But once Christianity had taken hold of the Western world, a new breed of skeptics arose out of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Voltaire, the noted French infidel who died in 1778, said that in 100 years from this time, Christianity would be swept from existence and passed into history. But what has happened? Voltaire has passed into history, while the circulation of the Bible continues to increase in almost all the parts of the world, carrying blessing wherever it goes. Only 50 years after Voltaire's death, a Bible Society used a hotel not far from his home in Lausanne as a depot for storing stacks of Bibles, a great irony of history. The early American patriot Thomas Paine published Age of Reason, a popular book ridiculing Christianity. Although Paine was a deist and not an atheist, he popularized the theory that the books of the Bible, especially the Gospels, were full of contradictions. This view continues to be popular among scholars even to this day. In the 1800s, rationalists such as Herman Samuel Romaris and David Strauss published sensational works denying the supernatural miracles of the Bible. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who coined the phrase, "God is dead," is said to have lost his faith around the time he was reading Strauss's Life of Jesus critically examined.